Good morning, everybody. We're going to be looking at the Kontakt Reference Manual 2.2 today of asynchronous completion states. So here we've got 2.2 on async complete. On async complete, async throws a callback triggered after the execution of any load or save command. So to resolve any synchronization issues, the commands mentioned above return unique IDs when being used. Upon completion of the command's action, the on async complete callback gets triggered, and the built-in variable native instrument's async ID is updated with the ID of the command that triggered the callback. If the command was completed successfully, for example, if the file was found and loaded successfully, the internal value of native instrument's async exit status is set to 1, otherwise it's 0. So what does this mean? Well, it means that if we're using any kind of like file loader or editor in this particular example, however, we can use this for a lot of different versions, it's going to give us kind of a fallback process. So this is really, really handy for when you are dealing with files where what happens if the user loads a text file when you've asked for a MIDI file, or a audio file when you've asked for a MIDI file, or a MIDI file when you've asked for an audio file, or any other kind of dumb mistake that can happen when you're either not being clear about what you've asked for, or they don't understand clearly. So I suppose it's probably more of a UI thing, but this is in the back end to try and help us out. So on init, so on initialization, so the very start of the Kontakt instrument, we need to use on init, and we're going to go into these through the whole course of using these. We're going to declare a variable being the $sign being variable load MIDI file ID, okay, and declare a UI button load MIDI file. So basically the idea here is that the user hits the UI button and it loads a MIDI file, right? From there we end on, because we're just doing the initialization stage, and this is just an example. On UI control, so whenever we're using a UI material or a UI button or dial or knob or something like that, we're going to use on UI control. Then UI control asks for what UI to use. So we're going to use load MIDI file, which is this declaration. Okay, or rather, actually, sorry, this UI button is called load MIDI file. So this load MIDI file UI button, that UI is being controlled by us, and whenever we control it, we are going to call this callback or use this callback. Okay, this function. So load MIDI file ID, which is the ID that we were talking about up here, the native instruments async ID that comes from the MIDI file, which will have its own identification path. We make sure that it is equal to where the MIDI file comes from and the MIDI file path. Okay. While the MIDI file, so a while loop starts here, just here, and the load MIDI file ID, which is the same as this declared variable and the same as the variable being changed by the path type, while it is equal to, or while the number of load MIDI file is -1, we don't do anything. Okay, so this is to prevent things like it loading up something incorrectly, or loading up something at the start when we're not really asking for that just yet. So it's a great thing to have in your script. And then we end our while loop and we throw a message of MIDI file loaded, because we're not in the while loop, we're assuming that it has been loaded correctly. So we skip this because it's not 1. So the load MIDI file ID is not 1. The ID is not 1. Oh, sorry, not -1. Then we end that while loop and we say we have loaded the file successfully. This doesn't have anything to do with playing the MIDI file. Okay, we're not going to get into that just yet. Then we end the UI control. So we're leaving this part of the loop and we're starting on async complete. Now async complete, remember that's the function we're talking about today, triggered after the execution of any load or save command. Okay, so on async complete, if native instruments async ID is equal to the load MIDI file ID, then we make the load MIDI file ID equal -1, which means we get stuck in this loop. Okay, so this means what happens here is that at the start, when we boot up a new instrument with this functionality in it, it will immediately not load a MIDI file and will wait for us to load a MIDI file. Okay, so that we will not get the MIDI file loaded functionality happening straight away, because we're equal to -1, which is what we're looking for. Okay, so let's jump into logic again and knock this up. So new instrument, boot that guy up and open up our script editor again. So we're going to start with on init, declare load MIDI file ID. Okay, and declare a UI button. And you'll notice again the syntax really important here. So this is declaring a UI button. So declare, there's going to be a variable coming, UI button, the UI thing, then what it is called. Okay, and now button is obviously almost like a child relationship of the UI. So that's why we put UI underscore button, not button underscore UI, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, so then we need to start thinking about our UI functionality. So we've got on UI control, we're going to load our MIDI file. Okay, the load MIDI file ID. So this is where we're going to be checking that little colon equals is going to set it to this. So load MIDI file path. Have I done that? Nope. So again, we've always got to check that we're getting this correct, because Kontakt won't help us out too much if we don't. While load MIDI file ID is equal, so it's while it's -1, remember, so this is the pause functionality. We're going to wait. We don't want to do a huge wait time because we will get stuck with it sort of cascading and freezing up our computer. So ideally it's just going to check, and then once we've loaded up something, it'll be kicking along okay. File loaded successfully. Okay, again, quotation marks before close brackets. So end on. So now we've finished our on UI control load MIDI file, the button, okay, which will pop up here in a moment if I even hit apply. Oh, let's see what we've done wrong. So what have we done wrong here? Load MIDI file ID equal to load MIDI file dash path. Okay, this is a good start. So load MIDI file ID. I think we've done all that right. Load MIDI file ID.